who liquidated my entire portfolio. Ethan Caldwell's voice tore through the silence of his $18 million Manhattan penthouse at exactly 6:12 a.m., his phone vibrating uncontrollably in his hand as red numbers flooded every screen in front of him, lines collapsing, assets vanishing, years of power dissolving in seconds. And for a moment he couldn't breathe, not because he didn't understand what was happening, but because deep down he did. And somewhere in the back of his mind, a single image surfaced with terrifying clarity: a hand, extended across a polished glass table just 24 hours earlier, steady, patient, unmistakably deliberate. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your city or country in the comments below. And if you believe in dignity and justice, hit like and subscribe. These stories spark change, and we're glad you're here. Now, back to Darius Cole. The room had been quiet that afternoon, the kind of quiet reserved for people who believe they controlled outcomes, skylines stretching behind them, sunlight cutting through floor-to-ceiling windows, and Ethan stood at the head of the table like he owned not just the company, but the air itself, until Darius stepped forward, dressed in a simple black suit. No designer labels, no entourage, just presence. The kind that didn't announce itself but settled into a room like gravity, and without hesitation, he extended his hand. It wasn't rushed. It wasn't forced. It was respect, offered clean and direct. Ethan looked at it, paused just long enough for everyone to notice, then adjusted his cuff instead, eyes sliding away as if the gesture had never existed. No handshake, no acknowledgement, just absence. A few people shifted in their seats, subtle, almost invisible, but the room felt it, that quiet fracture that didn't need words to echo. "We keep things professional here," Ethan said casually, voice smooth, controlled, the kind of tone that wrapped disrespect in something that sounded like policy. Darius didn't respond. Not with words. Not with expression. He lowered his hand slowly, as if placing something down rather than losing it, then took his seat, posture relaxed, eyes steady, absorbing everything without giving anything away. Across the table, a junior analyst named Lena Brooks frowned slightly, her pen hovering midair, because something about that moment didn't sit right. Not the silence, not the dismissal, not the way Darius didn't react at all. The meeting moved on, or at least pretended to. Slides advanced. Numbers were discussed. Voices filled the space. But every time Darius tried to speak, he was redirected, interrupted, repositioned into the background like he had never been invited to the foreground in the first place. "Let's have someone more aligned with the strategy walk us through this," Ethan added at one point, not even looking in his direction, and a few light chuckles followed, the kind that float just under the surface, deniable but unmistakable. Darius nodded once, as if acknowledging a detail no one else could see, then leaned back slightly, fingers resting loosely against the table, calm, composed, unmoved. If anyone had been watching closely, they would have noticed it, the shift, subtle but irreversible, like a switch flipping behind still eyes. But most people weren't watching closely. They were watching Ethan. They were watching the performance of control. And they had no idea that the real control had just entered the room, offered a hand, been refused, and quietly decided not to offer it again. The meeting did not end with applause or tension. It ended with something far more dangerous: normalcy. Chairs sliding back, laptops closing, polite nods exchanged like nothing had shifted, like nothing had been said without being said, and Ethan Caldwell walked out of the room first, confident, composed, already moving on to his next call, as if the last hour had simply confirmed what he believed all along, that control belonged to him, that rooms like that bent in his direction. But behind him, Darius Cole remained seated for just a moment longer, not frozen, not delayed, just still, the kind of stillness that carried intention rather than hesitation, his eyes scanning the now empty chairs, the reflections on the glass table, the faint imprint of hands that had rested there minutes before, and then he stood, smooth, unhurried, picking up his tablet without checking it, because he did not need to. He already knew what came next. In the hallway, conversations resumed in fragments, low voices, quick glances, the kind of corporate whisper that tries to process something it cannot quite name, and Lena Brooks lingered near the door, pretending to review her notes while her attention stayed fixed on Darius as he stepped out. There was something about the way he moved that did not match the role he had been given in that room. Not a consultant, not an outsider. Something else, something she could not yet define but could not ignore. Ethan's voice echoed faintly from down the corridor, already laughing with another executive, already rewriting the narrative of what had just happened. "We will have someone more aligned handle the numbers," he said, dismissive, final, as if decisions were declarations rather than consequences. And for most people, that would have been the end of it, a small moment buried under larger agendas. Another quiet dismissal in a system that ran on them. But Darius did not follow that pattern. He stopped near a window overlooking the city, sunlight catching the edge of his watch, and for a brief second, his reflection met his own eyes, not questioning, not reacting, simply confirming. And then he reached into his pocket and took out his phone. No hesitation, no dramatic pause, just action aligned with certainty. The call connected on the first ring. "This is Cole," he said, voice even, measured, carrying none of the weight the moment deserved on the surface, and on the other end, a voice responded immediately, sharp, attentive, prepared. "We are ready when you are, sir." Darius glanced once toward the conference room behind him, now empty, now irrelevant, then back to the skyline stretching across Manhattan like a grid of decisions waiting to be made. "Initiate a full exposure analysis on Caldwell Holdings," he said, each word precise, controlled, like he was placing pieces on a board only he could see. "I want every position, every dependency, every unsecured layer identified within the hour." There was no surprise on the other end, only movement, keys already clicking, systems already shifting. "Understood. Do you want escalation protocols prepared?" Darius did not answer immediately, not because he was unsure, but because timing mattered more than reaction, and in that silence, the shape of what was coming began to form, not loud, not visible, but inevitable. Lena watched from a distance as he ended the call, her instincts pressing harder now, because whatever had just been set in motion did not feel like retaliation, it felt like design. Darius slipped the phone back into his pocket and walked forward, past her, not acknowledging the stares, not needing to, because the moment had already moved beyond the room, beyond the handshake, beyond the man who thought he had controlled it, and somewhere deep within the systems that powered everything Ethan believed he owned, something had just begun to shift. The first signal did not come with a warning. It came quietly, buried inside a routine notification that no one at Caldwell Holdings paid attention to at first. A minor alert flagged in the risk management system at exactly 2:47 p.m., a slight shift in exposure, a small percentage point adjustment that would normally be absorbed without question. But this time it did not stabilize, it moved again, and then again, subtle at first, almost polite, like a door being tested before it is opened. Across the trading floor, analysts glanced at their screens, then back at each other, unsure if what they were seeing was a glitch or something else entirely, because positions that had been stable for months were beginning to show stress, not dramatic, not catastrophic, just enough to feel wrong. Ethan Caldwell was still in control, or at least that is what he believed, standing in his office reviewing a separate deal, his confidence untouched, his earlier dismissal already filed away as insignificant, until his assistant knocked once and stepped in, her tone careful, measured. "There is a fluctuation in the Asia-linked portfolio," she said, holding a tablet slightly tighter than usual. Ethan did not look up immediately. "Then adjust it," he replied, casual, dismissive, the kind of answer that assumed the system would obey. But the system did not correct. It continued. In another part of the building, Lena Brooks stared at her monitor, her screen filled with cascading data that refused to align with expectation, correlations breaking, dependencies unraveling. And for the first time since she had joined the firm, she felt something she could not quantify, not fear, but awareness, the realization that what she was watching was not random. It was structured, it was intentional, and it was precise. She opened a secondary window, cross-checking exposure maps, tracing the origin of the shift, and what she found made her sit up straighter, because the movement was not coming from within their own trades. It was external, coordinated, like someone was pulling threads from multiple directions at once, each move small on its own, but together forming a pattern that tightened around the entire portfolio. Back in his office, Ethan's phone buzzed again, this time from a senior partner. We are seeing pressure across 3 sectors simultaneously. The voice said, no longer calm, no longer routine. Ethan frowned slightly, just enough to register irritation rather than concern. That is not possible without a trigger, he said, stepping toward his screen now. Find the source. But even as he said it, more alerts appeared, lines of credit tightening, counterparties reassessing positions, not pulling out yet, but preparing, like a crowd sensing a shift before the sound reaches them. Lena's fingers moved faster now, pulling historical data, mapping influence chains, and then she saw it, a name buried deep within a network of controlling interests, not listed at the surface level, not obvious, but there, consistent, repeated, quiet but dominant. Cole Holdings. Her breath caught for just a second as the connection formed, not fully understood yet, but enough to send a signal through her instincts that the moment in that conference room had not ended, it had only changed form. Somewhere across the city, in an office far removed from the noise, Darius Cole sat in front of a single screen, not surrounded by chaos, not reacting, just watching, his hand resting lightly on the desk as data moved exactly where it was supposed to move, each shift aligning with a design that had been decided the moment respect was withheld. And as another set of numbers updated, he leaned back slightly, not in satisfaction, not in celebration, but in confirmation, because what was happening now was not revenge, it was consequence, unfolding with the kind of precision that did not need to be explained to be understood. By 3:18 p.m., the room that once carried quiet confidence began to feel different, not loud, not chaotic, but unsettled, like something invisible had entered and refused to leave. And Ethan Caldwell felt it before he fully understood it. The way his phone would not stop vibrating, the way messages began stacking faster than they could be read, partners asking questions instead of confirming decisions, analysts requesting direction instead of executing it. And for the first time that day, he stopped moving and actually looked at the numbers in front of him. They were no longer drifting. They were aligning against him. What am I looking at? He asked, his voice lower now, sharper, directed at no one and everyone at the same time. And across the floor, screens continued to update in real time, positions compressing, margins tightening, liquidity thinning out like oxygen at high altitude, nothing crashing yet, but everything preparing to. Lena Brooks stood from her desk without realizing she had done it, her chair rolling back slightly as her eyes stayed locked on the web of data she had pulled together. And now the pattern was no longer subtle. It was undeniable, multiple sectors moving in synchronized pressure, external influence targeting specific leverage points, not random, not reactive, but deliberate, like someone who understood exactly where the structure would bend first. She walked quickly toward Ethan's office, tablet in hand, hesitation replaced by urgency. This is not market behavior, she said the moment she stepped inside, her voice steady but carrying weight. Ethan looked up, irritation flashing first, then fading as he saw the data she was holding. Then what is it? He asked. Lena swallowed once, then said it. It is targeted exposure compression. Someone is tightening every unsecured layer at the same time. The room went quiet in a way that felt heavier than before, because this time the silence carried meaning. Ethan turned back to his screen, fingers moving now, pulling up deeper layers, tracing positions he had not needed to question in years, and that was when he saw it, not all at once, but enough to disturb the narrative he had built around his own control, recurring influence points, quiet capital entries, ownership percentages that did not dominate individually, but collectively formed something far more powerful than surface ownership. Who is behind this? He asked, but this time the question was not rhetorical. Lena did not answer immediately. She zoomed in on one cluster, then another, following the same name appearing again and again, never loud, never central, but always present, always connected. Cole Holdings. The name sat there, unassuming, almost easy to overlook, but now impossible to ignore. Ethan leaned back slowly, his expression shifting, not yet fear, but something close to recognition, like hearing a name you should have remembered earlier. That is not possible, he said under his breath. But the numbers did not care what was possible. They continued to move, continued to tighten, continued to respond to something outside his reach. Across the city, in a space far removed from the rising tension, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been, seated, composed, one screen in front of him reflecting the same data that was now unraveling Ethan's certainty. But to Darius, it was not unraveling. It was alignment, every adjustment falling into place with quiet precision, every shift confirming what had already been decided. And as another notification appeared, he glanced at it briefly, then back to the city beyond the glass. His expression unchanged, because this was never about reacting in the moment. It was about understanding that the moment had already passed, and what followed was simply the result of it. By 4:02 p.m., the illusion of control had fully begun to fracture, not in a dramatic collapse, but in something far more unsettling, a steady erosion that no one in the room could stop. And Ethan Caldwell felt it in the way people no longer waited for his direction before acting, the way conversations shifted from confidence to caution, the way every answer he gave was now followed by another question. "Lock the positions," he said sharply, stepping out of his office and onto the floor, his voice cutting through the noise. But the response was not immediate compliance, it was hesitation. "We are trying," one of the senior analysts replied, eyes still fixed on his screen. "But counterparties are adjusting terms in real time. They are not holding exposure." That word, counterparties, landed differently now, because it meant the pressure was not internal, it was external, and it was spreading. Ethan's jaw tightened as he moved closer, scanning the data himself, watching as liquidity thinned further, as if the market itself had decided to step back and let something else take control. "Find the source and isolate it," he said. But even as he spoke, he understood that isolation was no longer an option. Whatever had been initiated was already too integrated, too precise. Across the floor, Lena Brooks continued tracing the pattern, her earlier uncertainty now replaced with clarity that felt heavier than panic, because panic was chaotic, and this was not. This was structured, intentional, almost surgical in the way it applied pressure exactly where it would matter most. She opened another layer of data, pulling in historical ownership maps, cross-referencing influence chains, and what she saw made her stop completely for a fraction of a second, because the deeper she looked, the clearer it became that Cole Holdings was not just involved, it was foundational, not visible at the surface, but embedded in the very structure that supported Caldwell Holdings' most valuable positions. She walked back toward Ethan, slower this time, not because she was unsure, but because she understood the weight of what she was about to say. "It is not just exposure," she said quietly, but clearly enough for those nearby to hear. "It is control." Ethan turned to her, his expression sharpening, the room around them fading into background noise. "Explain," he demanded. Lena lifted the tablet, highlighting the overlapping structures, the hidden layers of ownership that had gone unnoticed because they were never meant to be obvious. "These positions," she continued, "they are interconnected through a controlling network that we do not own." She paused for half a second, then said the name again, this time without hesitation. "Cole Holdings." The silence that followed was different from before. It was not confusion. It was realization beginning to form, slow, heavy, unavoidable. Ethan looked back at the screen, his mind racing through the last 24 hours, the meeting, the dismissal, the hand he had refused, and for the first time, the memory did not feel small, it felt significant. "That does not give him this level of influence," he said, but his voice had lost its earlier certainty, because the numbers in front of him were proving otherwise, layer by layer, dependency by dependency, showing a network that had been built over time, quietly, deliberately, until it no longer needed to announce itself to control outcomes. Across the city, Darius Cole remained still, his phone resting on the desk beside him, screen lighting up periodically with confirmations, approvals, adjustments executed exactly as instructed, and with each notification, the system on the other side tightened further, not violently, not recklessly, but with discipline, the kind that comes from understanding not just how to build power, but when to use it. He did not smile. He did not react. He simply watched, because for him, this was not a surprise. It was the continuation of a decision already made, and as the sun began to lower over the skyline, casting longer shadows across the city, one thing became clear. This was no longer a situation that Ethan Caldwell could manage. It was a structure he had never fully seen, now revealing itself one consequence at a time. By 4:37 p.m., The room no longer tried to pretend everything was under control. The tone had shifted completely. Voices were lower but faster, movements sharper, decisions no longer confident but reactive, and Ethan Caldwell stood in the center of it all, realizing that every command he gave was arriving too late to matter, like trying to steer something that had already chosen its direction. "Stabilize liquidity now," he said, his voice firm but edged with urgency. And for the first time, no one responded immediately, not because they did not hear him, but because they already knew the truth. Liquidity was not something you could force back once it started pulling away, especially not when someone else was controlling the pace of that withdrawal. Across the floor, screens continued updating in relentless rhythm, margins tightening further, credit windows narrowing, automated safeguards triggering across systems that had once worked quietly in the background, now lighting up like warning signals no one could ignore. Lena Brooks remained focused on her data, but her role had changed. She was no longer just observing. She was connecting, mapping, understanding, and what she was seeing was no longer just a pattern. It was architecture, something built over time with intention, something that had been in place long before this moment, waiting. She pulled up a deeper layer of ownership records, tracing back through years of acquisitions, silent entries, minority stakes that seemed insignificant individually, but together formed something undeniable. And the deeper she went, the clearer it became that Cole Holdings was not reacting to Caldwell Holdings. It had been positioned around it, anticipating, calculating, preparing for a moment exactly like this. "This was built in advance," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone else, but Ethan heard it. He turned toward her, his expression no longer dismissive, now sharpened by something closer to concern. "Built for what?" he asked. Lena met his eyes, and for a brief second, the entire room seemed to pause around them. "For leverage," she answered. The words settled heavily, because leverage meant control without ownership, influence without visibility, power without announcement, and suddenly the absence of a handshake did not feel like a small moment anymore. It felt like a miscalculation. Ethan looked back at his screen, pulling up communication logs, trying to find a gap, a weakness, something he could use to regain footing. But every path he traced led back to the same realization. The system was no longer responding to him. It was responding to something else. "Reach out to our primary partners," he said, shifting strategy, his tone tightening. "We need immediate confirmation of support." An assistant moved quickly, dialing, sending requests, but the responses that came back were not what he expected. They were cautious, delayed, conditional, language that signaled distance rather than alignment. "They are reviewing exposure," she said, trying to keep her voice steady. Ethan closed his eyes briefly, just for a second, then opened them again, sharper, more focused, but the room could feel it now. The shift, the realization that whatever had been set in motion was not a fluctuation, not a temporary disruption, but a controlled contraction, one that tightened with every passing minute. Across the city, Darius Cole remained exactly where he had been. The same calm posture, the same measured stillness, his screen reflecting the same cascading adjustments now causing tension elsewhere. But to him, it was not tension, it was alignment reaching its next phase. And as his phone lit up again, he glanced at the message, a simple confirmation that another layer had been secured, another dependency locked. And he placed the phone back down without reaction, because this was never about watching someone fall. It was about allowing a system to reveal what it truly depended on. And as the afternoon moved closer to evening, one thing became undeniable. The balance of power had already shifted, and it had done so without a single raised voice, without a single warning, without even a handshake. By 5:12 p.m., the floor had transformed into something unrecognizable, not chaotic, but compressed, like every second carried more weight than the last. Conversations overlapping, decisions stacking, and still nothing slowing the pressure that continued to build beneath it all. And Ethan Caldwell stood at the center of it, no longer directing the room, but reacting to it, his earlier confidence replaced by a sharp, controlled urgency that could not quite hide the fact that he was now following a situation he did not fully understand. "Get me a direct line to Cole Holdings," he said suddenly, the name landing differently this time. No longer theoretical, no longer distant, but immediate, necessary, and around him, A few heads turned, not in confusion, but in recognition, because they had all seen it now. The pattern, the presence, the quiet dominance that had been there all along. His assistant hesitated for half a second, just enough to be noticed, then nodded and stepped away quickly, dialing, searching, escalating through channels that suddenly felt harder to access than they should have been. Across the room, Lena Brooks watched this shift carefully, because this was the moment where awareness turned into consequence, where the recognition of power forced a response, and she could see it clearly now. The entire system they had relied on was not failing. It was responding to a higher level of control, one that had never needed to announce itself until now. "It is already too late for a conversation," she said quietly, not challenging, not confrontational, just stating what the data had already proven, and Ethan heard her, even if he did not want to accept it. "Nothing is too late," he replied, but the conviction in his voice was thinner now, stretched by the reality forming around him. The assistant returned moments later, her expression careful, professional, but unmistakably different. "We are not able to reach anyone directly," she said, choosing her words with precision. "Their office has redirected all inquiries to a central system review channel." That response did not sound like a delay. It sounded like a boundary. Ethan exhaled slowly, turning back to the screens, watching as another set of alerts rolled through, positions tightening further, automated triggers engaging across multiple sectors at once, each one reinforcing the same reality. The system was no longer flexible, it was locking. Lena stepped closer, her voice still calm, but now carrying a clarity that could not be ignored. "This was never about reacting to us," she said. "This was about waiting for us to reveal our weakest point." Ethan looked at her again, this time not dismissing, not questioning, but listening, because the evidence was no longer abstract. It was visible, measurable, undeniable. "And what is that?" he asked. Lena did not hesitate. "Assumption," she said. The word hung in the air, simple, direct, but heavier than anything else that had been said all day, because it pointed to something deeper than numbers, deeper than strategy. It pointed to the moment in that conference room, the decision made without thinking, the dismissal that felt routine at the time, but now echoed with consequence. Ethan turned away slightly, his gaze shifting back to the skyline beyond the glass. But for the first time, the view did not feel like something he owned. It felt distant, detached, like something he was watching instead of controlling. Across the city, Darius Cole remained still, the same calm presence, the same measured pace, his screen now showing fewer changes, not because the system had stopped, but because it had reached a stage where it no longer needed adjustment. Everything was already in motion, every dependency aligned, every outcome set on a path that did not require further input. And as he rested his hand lightly against the desk, he did not look at the numbers. He looked beyond them, because the numbers were never the point. They were only the reflection of a decision made in a quiet room, when a hand was extended and respect was declined. And now, without a single raised voice, the cost of that moment was being calculated in real time. By 5:46 p.m., the room reached a point where time itself felt distorted, minutes stretching longer than they should, every update carrying more consequence than the last. And yet no one spoke loudly anymore, because loudness belonged to certainty, and certainty had quietly disappeared. Ethan Caldwell stood still for the first time all day, not issuing commands, not redirecting attention, just watching as the final layers of his control continued to narrow, his reflection faintly visible in the glass behind the screens. A man who had always been ahead of outcomes now standing inside one he did not create. "Run a full historical trace," he said finally, his voice lower, more measured, as if trying to regain precision instead of force. "I want to know when this started." Across the floor, the request moved quickly, systems opening, archives loading, years of data unfolding in compressed time, and Lena Brooks followed it closely, her eyes scanning through timelines that stretched far beyond the current day, because she already knew the answer would not be recent. Something like this did not begin in a single afternoon. It began long before anyone noticed. As the data resolved, the pattern became clearer, not just in structure, but in history, quiet entries, calculated positions, moments where Cole holdings had appeared briefly, almost invisibly, acquiring influence without drawing attention, not disrupting markets, not announcing presence, just placing itself exactly where it needed to be, over and over again, until the structure was no longer dependent on visibility to hold power. Lena leaned slightly closer to her screen, her voice almost a whisper, but steady. "This goes back years," she said. Ethan did not respond immediately. He stepped closer, looking at the timeline himself, watching as connections formed across quarters, across sectors, across decisions he had once believed were independent, and for a moment, the room around him disappeared, replaced by a realization that did not arrive with shock, but with weight, slow, undeniable, settling in piece by piece. And in that stillness, something else surfaced, not on the screen, but in his memory, the image of that conference room, the extended hand, the pause, the decision to look away, and suddenly it did not feel like a moment of control. It felt like a moment of blindness. Across the city, Darius Cole sat in the same position, the same quiet presence, but now his eyes were not on the screen in front of him. They were slightly unfocused, as if looking through time rather than at it, because this moment was not new to him. It was familiar, not in detail, but in feeling. Years earlier, in a different room, under different lighting, he had extended his hand the same way, calm, direct, professional, and watched as it was ignored, not loudly, not aggressively, but in that same quiet, dismissive way that tried to pretend nothing had happened, and he remembered standing there for a fraction of a second longer than necessary, feeling the weight of something that was never acknowledged, not just in that room, but in many rooms after it. Moments stacked quietly over time, each one small on its own, but together forming a pattern that did not need explanation to be understood. He did not react then either. He learned. He adjusted. He built. And now, years later, that same pattern had led to this exact point, not as revenge, not as reaction, but as resolution. Back in the present, Ethan exhaled slowly, his eyes still fixed on the timeline, but his focus no longer on the numbers. It had shifted to something else, something deeper, the realization that this was never just about positions or portfolios. It was about perspective, about what he had seen and what he had chosen not to see. And as another update rolled across the screens, confirming what could no longer be reversed, one truth settled quietly into the room. This had not started today, it had only been revealed today, and the cost of that revelation was still unfolding. By 6:21 p.m., the last layer of illusion was gone, not shattered, not violently removed, but dissolved, leaving behind something far more unsettling, clarity, and Ethan Caldwell stood in front of it with nowhere left to redirect his attention, nowhere left to place blame that the data would support, because every path he traced, every structure he examined, every dependency he tried to isolate led back to the same conclusion. This was not a collapse. It was a withdrawal, controlled, deliberate, and already too far advanced to interrupt. "What happens if this continues through close?" he asked, his voice steady but carrying a weight that had not been there before, and no one answered immediately, not because they did not know, but because saying it out loud would make it real in a way that numbers alone had not yet done. Lena Brooks looked at the projection in front of her, the timelines, the pressure points, the acceleration curves, and she understood the trajectory with a precision that left no room for optimism. "Then it does not stabilize," she said finally. "It resolves." The word landed differently, quieter than panic, heavier than alarm, because resolution meant an end state, not a temporary phase. Ethan nodded once, slowly, absorbing it, then turned back to his screen, but his posture had changed, not defeated, not yet, but no longer leading. He was now witnessing. Across the floor, messages continued to arrive, confirmations from external partners adjusting positions, notices from institutions tightening terms, automated systems completing actions that no longer required human approval, and each one reinforced the same reality. Control had shifted, not loudly, not publicly, but completely. "Prepare a full internal briefing," Ethan said after a moment, his tone measured, controlled, but now directed toward understanding rather than stopping. "I want every exposure mapped before the market closes." It was not a command to fix the situation. It was a command to see it clearly. Lena nodded, already moving, her earlier urgency replaced with focus, because at this point, Clarity was the only thing left to gain. As she compiled the data, layering it into a single view, the structure revealed itself in full for the first time. Not fragmented, not partial, but complete. And what it showed was not just influence. It was ownership of outcome, a network that did not need to dominate publicly because it controlled the pathways everything else depended on. Cole Holdings was no longer just a name in the system. It was the system that mattered. Ethan stared at it, his eyes tracing the connections, the overlaps, the silent positions that had never been questioned. And for a moment, everything else in the room faded. The noise, the movement, the urgency, all of it reduced to background. Because the realization now was not about numbers, it was about perspective, about what he had believed control looked like and what it actually was. Across the city, Darius Cole remained exactly as he had been, calm, composed, his presence unchanged, but the environment around him had shifted into stillness, not because nothing was happening, but because everything that needed to happen was already in motion. And as his screen displayed the final sequence of confirmations for the day, he did not lean forward, he did not react, he simply observed, because this moment was not the peak, it was the midpoint, the place where recognition began on one side and completion approached on the other. And as the clock moved closer to market close, one truth settled fully into place. This was never about taking something away. It was about revealing who had been holding it all along. At 6:58 p.m., the final minutes before market close carried a different kind of silence, not the absence of sound, but the presence of certainty, the kind that settles in when outcomes are no longer negotiable. And Ethan Caldwell stood in front of it with his hands resting lightly on the edge of the desk, his posture composed, but his stillness no longer strategic. It was acceptance forming in real time. The screens in front of him continued their steady progression, numbers adjusting, positions resolving, automated systems completing processes that had been triggered hours earlier. And now those processes were reaching their final phase, not accelerating, not slowing, just finishing exactly as designed. "Give me the final exposure summary," he said, his voice even, controlled, but stripped of the urgency that had defined it earlier, because urgency implied influence, and influence was no longer his to exercise. Lena Brooks stepped forward with the compiled data, her movements precise, her expression focused, because this moment required clarity, not reaction. She placed the summary in front of him, the full structure mapped out, every dependency, every leverage position, every external control point now visible in one unified view. Ethan looked at it without speaking, his eyes moving across the layers, the connections, the pathways that had once operated invisibly beneath his decisions, and now stood exposed, undeniable. "It was never ours," he said quietly, not as a question, but as a realization. Lena did not respond immediately. She simply nodded once, because the data had already answered. Across the floor, activity had slowed, not because the work was finished, but because the outcome had been determined. Analysts watching rather than adjusting, systems finalizing rather than calculating. And in that shift, the room itself seemed to exhale, not in relief, but in recognition. Ethan straightened slightly, his gaze lifting from the data to the reflection of the city beyond the glass. Lights beginning to come on as the sun dipped lower, the skyline unchanged, indifferent to what had just unfolded inside this building. "When did he take control?" he asked after a moment, his tone no longer defensive, but searching for something precise. Lena glanced back at the timeline, then returned her eyes to him. "He did not take control today," she said. "He revealed it today." The distinction settled heavily, because it reframed everything, not as a loss, but as a misunderstanding that had been corrected. Ethan nodded slowly, absorbing it, and for the first time since the meeting, he allowed the memory to return fully, not just the image, but the meaning behind it, the extended hand, the pause, the decision to ignore it. And now that moment stood differently in his mind, not as a small act of dismissal, but as the exact point where he had chosen not to see what was in front of him. Across the city, Darius Cole remained seated, the same calm presence, but now the notifications on his screen had slowed to a near stop. Confirmations complete, processes closed, the system having moved from execution to conclusion, and he did not need to review the details. He already understood the outcome, because it had been defined long before the final numbers appeared. He rested his hand lightly against the desk, his gaze steady, not on the screen, but beyond it, as if acknowledging something larger than the transaction itself. And in that quiet, the weight of the day settled into its final form, not loud, not dramatic, but absolute. Because what had just happened was not the result of force, it was the result of structure, of patience, of understanding where power truly lived. And as the closing bell approached, one truth remained: the moment that seemed small had never been small at all. It had simply been misunderstood until it was too late to correct. At exactly 7 p.m., the closing bell did not ring loudly in the room, but everyone felt it, not as a sound, but as a line being drawn, a moment separating what had been assumed from what was now undeniable. And Ethan Caldwell stood still as the final update settled across the screens in front of him, not flickering, not shifting anymore, just fixed, resolved, complete. The numbers had stopped moving because there was nowhere left for them to go. The system had finished what it started. Across the floor, no one spoke at first, not because they did not know what to say, but because there was nothing left to interpret. The outcome was no longer developing. It had arrived. Lena Brooks lowered her tablet slightly, her eyes still scanning the final structure. But now it was no longer a question of what might happen. It was a confirmation of what had already happened. And in that confirmation, something shifted inside her. Not shock, not disbelief, but clarity, the kind that changes how you see everything that came before it. Ethan exhaled slowly, his gaze steady on the final summary. And for the first time all day, he did not try to adjust anything, did not issue a command, did not search for an alternative path, because there was none. The system had closed around a decision that had been made long before this moment, and now it simply reflected it. Finalize internal reports, he said quietly, his voice controlled, measured, but no longer attempting to lead the outcome, only to document it. Around him, the team moved again, but differently this time, not reacting, not trying to prevent anything, just recording, processing, accepting. One analyst leaned back in his chair, staring at his screen as if waiting for something to change, but nothing did. Another removed his headset slowly, placing it down with care, as if even small movements now carried weight. The room had not erupted, it had settled, and that settling carried more gravity than any reaction could have. Ethan stepped back from the desk slightly, his reflection in the glass clearer now against the darkening skyline, and for a brief moment, he looked at himself not as the person who had controlled the room hours earlier, but as someone who had misunderstood it, and that distinction sat quietly, heavy but precise. Schedule a board review first thing in the morning, he added, his tone returning to structure, but not authority, because authority had shifted, even if it had not yet been formally acknowledged. Lena nodded once, already noting it, her role now grounded in clarity rather than urgency. Across the city, Darius Cole stood up from his chair for the first time in hours, not abruptly, not with any visible sense of victory, just a smooth, deliberate movement, like closing a chapter that had already been written. His screen remained on, the final confirmations resting in place, but he did not look at them again, because he did not need to. The outcome had never depended on watching it unfold, only on knowing it would. He walked toward the window, the city lights stretching out beneath him, steady, indifferent, and for a moment, he stood there in silence, not reflecting on the day, not replaying the meeting, just present, because what had been resolved today was not just a financial structure, it was something deeper, something that had taken years to build and only minutes to reveal. Back in the office across town, Ethan remained where he was, the room quieter now, the tension replaced with something more permanent, understanding, and as the last system update locked into place, one truth became impossible to ignore. Nothing had been taken from him that day. It had simply been shown that it was never his to begin with. The night did not bring relief. It brought silence, the kind that lingers after something irreversible has already taken place. And by 9:42 p.m., Ethan Caldwell was no longer surrounded by noise, no longer interrupted by alerts or voices. Just the low hum of a nearly empty office and the soft glow of screens that now displayed finalized outcomes instead of shifting possibilities. He stood alone in his office, jacket off, tie loosened, not undone out of exhaustion, but out of habit, because even now he was still trying to maintain structure in a moment that had already stripped it away. The final report sat open in front of him, not demanding attention, not flashing warnings, just existing, complete, precise, undeniable. He read through them slowly, line by line, not searching for errors anymore, not expecting reversals, just absorbing what had already been confirmed: positions closed, liquidity withdrawn, exposure resolved, and every detail pointed to the same conclusion. Nothing had malfunctioned, nothing had broken, everything had functioned exactly as it was designed to, just not under his control. Across the city, Darius Cole had already left his office, the building quiet behind him. The day concluded not with celebration, not with acknowledgement, but with the same calm presence he had carried into it, stepping into the night air as if nothing unusual had happened, because for him, nothing had. This was not an extraordinary moment, it was a predictable one. Back inside the office, Ethan leaned forward slightly, resting his hands against the desk, his reflection faintly visible in the glass. And for the first time since the morning, he allowed the question to surface fully, not about the market, not about the structure, but about himself, about the moment that had started it all. And as he replayed it in his mind, the extended hand, the pause, the decision to ignore it, he saw it now with a clarity that had not been available then, not as a small act of dismissal, but as a signal he had chosen not to read. The room that had once felt like his domain now felt different, not taken, not occupied, just revealed, like a space he had misunderstood from the beginning. And that realization settled into him slowly, not with force, but with weight. He straightened up again, closing one of the reports, then another, not in frustration, but in completion, because there was nothing left to review that would change what had already been decided. Across the building, a few lights flickered off as the last employees left, the day officially ending for everyone else. But for Ethan, the end of the day did not feel like a reset. It felt like a transition into something else, something that would not be resolved overnight, something that would carry forward into every decision that followed. And somewhere beyond. The immediate consequences, beyond the numbers and the reports and the structures that had just shifted, one thought remained, quiet but persistent, not loud enough to disrupt, but clear enough to stay. The understanding that respect had never been about the gesture itself. It had been about recognition, and when that recognition was denied, the cost was not immediate, it was delayed, calculated, and far greater than it ever appeared in the moment. The morning did not arrive with noise or urgency. It arrived with stillness, the kind that follows a decision already made. And at 7:03 a.m., Ethan Caldwell sat alone in his office, the city just beginning to move outside his window while everything inside the room remained unchanged. The same desk, the same screens, the same structure, but none of it felt the same anymore. The reports from the night before were still open, not updated, not corrected, because there was nothing left to adjust, and for a moment, he did not reach for them. He simply sat there, looking out across a skyline that no longer reflected control, but perspective. The events of the previous day did not replay in fragments anymore. They aligned, clearly, precisely, not as isolated moments, but as a single sequence that had led exactly where it was always going to lead. And at the center of that sequence was something he could no longer ignore, not the market, not the system, but the moment he had dismissed without thought, the hand he had refused without recognition. He leaned back slightly, exhaling slowly, not out of frustration, not out of disbelief, but out of understanding, because what had happened was not random, it was not unfair, it was not even unexpected once seen clearly. It was simply the result of a decision made in a room where he believed power only looked one way. Across the city, Darius Cole moved through his morning without disruption, the same calm pace, the same measured presence, stepping into his office as if the previous day had been nothing more than a continuation of something already in motion, because for him, it had been. There was no shift in posture, no change in tone, no need to revisit what had already been. Resolved, he placed his tablet on the desk, glanced briefly at the finalized summaries, then set them aside without opening them again. Because the outcome had never been the point, the understanding had. Back in his office, Ethan finally stood, walking slowly toward the window, his reflection faint against the glass, and for the first time, He allowed himself to say it, not out loud, but clearly enough to hear it in his own mind. He had not lost control yesterday. He had revealed that he never had it in the way he thought. The distinction did not come with emotion. It came with clarity, and that clarity settled into something steady, something that would not disappear when the next meeting started or the next deal appeared. It would remain, shaping every interaction that followed. He turned back toward his desk, his movements deliberate, grounded, not trying to reclaim what was gone, but preparing to move forward with what had been understood. And as the city outside fully came to life, one final truth remained: quiet, precise, and impossible to ignore. Respect is not something you choose to give based on appearance or assumption. It is something you recognize or fail to recognize. And when you fail, the consequence does not need to announce itself. It simply arrives. Complete, undeniable, and already decided long before you realize what you missed.